Over the past several weeks, tens of thousands have taken to the streets to protest against police brutality, and to advocate for a variety of fundamental changes related to policing. As a result of these protests, some terms have been gaining a ton of traction in the political sphere, namely defund the police and abolish the police. Both movements seek to address the root cause of crime and over-policing by reallocating money from police budgets to social services like mental health and addiction centers, social workers, and affordable housing initiatives. You know, the stuff that actually helps people in need. It's clear that changes like this are vital to improving the state of policing in this country, but changing how policing works is only half of the battle. Let's talk about prisons. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that our current policing culture and private prison industry are interconnected. Both systems are mired with brutality, corruption, and the dehumanization of people deemed dangerous. The funny thing is, most of the dangerous people within our prison population are just poor people. According to the Prison Policy Institute, the poorest people concentrated at the lowest ends of the national income make up a majority of the prison population. 57% of men and 72% of women that are incarcerated have an income less than $22,000 a year. Why is that, though? Is it A, their culture? Do they B, have a crime gene? C, because poor people are possessed by the crime demon? Or D, they're just so damn bored? If you answered any of the above, you're a silly goose. Good fucking God, we're really going with silly goose. Okay. How about it's because being poor sucks? When people have to live paycheck to paycheck, they're more vulnerable to fall into crime. No one that's happy with their life wakes up and says, "Oh boy, who do I rob today?" No, it doesn't happen. When economic opportunities, schools, and other necessities are scarce in your area and you need to feed your family, crime quickly becomes the only way to survive. Heavily policing these poor communities doesn't help either. In fact, it only contributes to the circle of poverty. Take, for example, how, once getting out of prison, only 55% of inmates are making any sort of yearly income, typically less than a full-time minimum wage job. Overall, former inmates have 5 times the unemployment rate compared to the general population. Not only that, but economic and social welfare programs are far more restrictive towards former inmates. Depending on which state you live in, programs like subsidized housing, food stamps, and cash assistance can be denied to people convicted of a felony. So get that, the programs designed to help the poorest of the poor are denied to them. This level of poverty also has a clear effect on the youth and their likelihood of going to prison. Turns out that boys who come from the bottom 10% of family incomes are 20 times more likely to end up in prison once in adulthood. These kids are already growing up in poor neighborhoods, being raised by poor parents, and attending underfunded schools. And then we wonder why these people commit so much crime. All of this makes you wonder, what is the actual goal of prison anyway? Well, to prevent crime, right? Ideally, the threat of prison, combined with the unpleasant experience of going to prison, would result in people not going back. This going back is called recidivism, the tendency of a convicted criminal to reoffend. According to James Gallagher, a clinical professor of psychiatry and an adjunct professor of law at New York University, 2/3 of prisoners reoffend within 3 years of leaving prison, often with a more serious and violent offense. Can you imagine a business that fails at its core job 2/3 of the time? If any other institutions in America were as unsuccessful in achieving their ostensible purpose as our prisons are, we would shut them down tomorrow. Gilligan, along with colleague Bandy Lee, conducted an experiment in a prison in San Bruno, California. The greatest finding in this experiment showed that by introducing an intensive prisoner re-education program focused on nonviolence and de-escalation, they were able to cut violent incidences by 96.5% inside these controlled prison dorms. It also found that after participating in the program for at least 4 months, there was an 83% decrease in violent reoffending from former inmates. This program also showed to be better not just for inmates, but also for taxpayers. It saved taxpayers $4 for every $1 spent on it, due to the roughly $30,000 saved from lower incarceration rates. The only mystery is, why is this program not being adopted by every jail and prison in the country? Why are taxpayers not demanding that this be done? Well, because there's a capital gain to be made by mass incarceration. Since 2000, there has been a nearly 50% increase in the private prison population, making it about 12% of the entire prison population. Private prison companies need these numbers to go up in order to make greater profits. Don't believe us though? Take it from the horse's mouth. or rather from the private prison company CoreCivics' mouth. Our growth is generally dependent upon our ability to obtain new contracts to develop and manage new correctional and detention facilities. This possible growth depends on a number of factors we cannot control, including crime rates and sentencing patterns in various jurisdictions and acceptance of privatization. They lied about one thing though. Crime rates and sentencing patterns are factors that they can partially control. When companies like CoreCivics and lobbyist groups like Allé team up, they have the power to pay off congressional forces to create legislation which leads to harsher sentencing. The main objectives for CoreCivics and companies like them is to increase the number of prisoners and increase the time they serve, for the end goal of increasing profit. Mass incarceration also gives private industry an extra edge in how it exploits workers, since prisoners can be used for cheap labor. Whether it's working for the very walls that imprison them or working for a state-owned business, prisoners get paid dirt wages. The average income for regular prison jobs is 86 cents per day, while higher-end jobs outsourced to state-owned businesses range between 33 cents and $1.41 an hour. And don't forget that these inmates still have to pay for their own damn toilet paper. Our current prison system obviously shows no interest in actually rehabilitating criminals into upstanding citizens, ready to re-enter society. Rather, it only continues the circle of poverty, leaving most inmates to wind up in prison again. Furthermore, they fuel the material gain of the private prison industry, which seeks to outsource prisoners for cheap labor. Of course, these prisons aren't just filling up all by themselves. This is where we bring the police back into the discussion. The first defense that most people come up with when talking about our broken police force is that the problem lies with a, quote, few bad apples. When police brutality occurs, it's the fault of a handful of cops, and so long as they are charged, then the problem is solved. However, in the recent protests, this whole idea is clearly debunked. When peaceful protesters are getting pushed down and beaten by a few bad apples, there are more times than not many other cops in the background letting this happen. They become witness to criminal behavior and say nothing about it. Shouldn't the good apples be intervening when they see misconduct? This is why a common phrase you hear amongst activists is, all cops are bastards. This admittedly inflammatory slogan doesn't mean that every person who becomes a police officer is an evil human being, although some are. Rather, it points to the fact that the system of policing punishes the few good cops who speak up by labeling them as rats and firing them, and fails to punish the truly awful ones who commit the worst offenses. Over time, this system has trended towards retaining only the worst of the bunch, those willing to turn to violence before negotiation. It becomes effectively impossible to be a good cop. But why are the police so keen on pulling their guns out at the first sign of trouble? To answer that question, one has to turn to the increased militarization of the police. Take for example how since the early 90s, the US has been part of an exchange program with Israel in which over 1,500 participants have been trained by Israel's military force. According to reports, these trainings include tactics on community and urban policing. Cops are aggressive because they're trained to be aggressive by an outside military force that has a history in violating all sorts of human rights. That's not the only reason, obviously. There are lots of reasons why cops are so easily triggered, yes, pun intended, one of them being the overabundance of firearms training. According to a 2017 police violence report, recruits have 58 hours of firearms training compared to only 8 hours of de-escalation training. Cops are trained to shoot first, ask questions later. The same report also indicates that, of the over 1,100 people killed by police, 57% would have survived had the police de-escalated the situation rather than going for their gun. It's also important to note that there's a dangerous racial bias within our current police force, specifically against Black and Latinx people, who make up 56% of the incarcerated population. These are the same groups of people who are also the most economically impaired in this country. Starting to connect the dots? The police prey on these communities because they're the most vulnerable. This is evident in how Black people are disproportionately locked up at far higher rates for similar crimes compared to white people. Take weed. No, I don't mean take it now. I mean, let's look at the arrest rates for the usage of weed. Even though Black people and white people smoke weed at a similar rate, Black people are nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for it. With numbers like these, combined with mandatory minimum sentencing laws for drug use, it's clear to see why racialized people make up a majority of the prison population. So now that we've described the problem, we can start to discuss the possible solutions. What exactly does defunding the police mean? Well, to your average reactionary, this idea sets off some alarms. But what happens when someone tries to rob me? Who will I call? Fear not, comrade. We're not talking about completely abolishing the police. At least not yet. As stated in the beginning of the video, the main goal is to reallocate the billions of dollars spent on police budgets across the nation and spend them in areas that will actually serve the people. Funny, isn't it? By spending more money on education, housing, and other social infrastructures, we can collectively help the communities most affected by mass incarceration and police brutality. Not only should more of our budget be put towards social infrastructure, but there must also be serious reformation in how schools get their funding. The amount that any school gets within their state's district depends on the property taxes within that area. This means that neighborhoods with lower property wealth get less funding than neighborhoods with greater property wealth. But wait, throwing money at poor schools is proven to not work. Exactly, which is why we're not simply advocating to throw money at poor schools and lower income communities just to build expensive facilities, but rather create a more equitable funding system for education so that lower income communities can begin to break out of the cycle of unequal generational wealth. This way, children who are born into poor communities actually have a fighting chance when it comes to getting a decent education and being provided with enough extracurricular programs like school lunches and sports to the point where they'll become less likely to fall into crime in the streets. Once that's all set, then we can have a serious discussion about abolishing our current police force. First off, abolishing the police does not equal getting rid of any public safety response measures, but simply replacing them with something that isn't trying to shoot you dead on arrival. Take, for example, systems like the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety, located in the Bay Area of California, which is one of the few fully integrated public safety departments in the US. Members in this department simultaneously train to be police, firefighters, and EMT medics. Systems like these give recruits a vast amount of training in not just how to shoot straight, but in how to actually help people within their community. Departments like these tend to be closer knit to the communities they are in, along with being more cost efficient for taxpayers. Therein lies one of the greatest solutions to tackle police brutality, and that's making whichever public safety force one with their community. By creating a safety squad in which its members, or at the very least its leaders, are chosen directly by the people's will, this can make them far more accountable and far more removable for their actions. Defund the police is a growing sentiment in this country that could bring serious good, but in the long run means nothing if there's not an equally strong support for dismantling our current justice system. Only by building a nation more concerned with the well-being of the most vulnerable in our society can we help to mitigate the number of people that turn to crime. Along with that, we'll be building stronger and better funded communities and schools for the future generation to grow up in. If there's one thing you take away from this video, try to tilt your focus away from what prisoners deserve, because that's a nebulous subjective thing, and towards the material impact that our existing system of punishment has on the world. Thank you for watching.